Okay, this is group of Chapter 2, 1917 Revolutions of February and October. So I'm going to start off with a brief introduction. We have the regime that is quickly losing support in the beginning of 1917, and the people's wish was to get rid of Nicholas, not so much the monarchy, but eventually they wanted a democracy in Russia, and when the time was right, a new constitution would be decided. In the meantime, all of the elite and popular revolutions would band together, which is almost a repeat of 1905, and the new provisional government and Petrograd Soviets would plan for dual power because they rose to power simultaneously. But unfortunately, that did not work out because the popular revolution grew more radical while the elite revolution became more conservative in defense of property, law, and order. So here we have people being shot in the streets during the July days, and thus there is very little democracy in sight in Russia, because Russia was instead in the middle of a civil war. And to finish, the Bolsheviks ended up being successful at the end of the October Revolution. So now we're going to the February Revolution and dual power. The end of February brought the bread shortages, strikes, and lookouts brought about demonstration by women and female workers, and the guards refused to shoot the women because they believed it was inhumane. And the Duma could see that there was a lot of crisis and problems going on, and the Tsar was away at army headquarters, so they repeatedly asked to stay in session to take care of it, because they're remembering the situation of 1905, where there was a lot of crisis and the Tsar was looking to disband the riots, and he refused the Duma's request to remain in committee, but a secret Duma committee actually remained in session. So the Tsar was away at war, so he did not realize how big and serious the riots were when his ministers wrote to him, and he merely wanted the riots and the strikes disbanded. By February 28th, the revolution had taken over all of Russia, so when Nicholas returned, he was asked to abdicate politely, which he realized, this is what I must do, this is the right choice. So he decided to abdicate in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael. And this is a picture of him at Tsarskoye Selo during confinement, and he pretty much behaved like a private citizen until his death in 1918. Politicians were very excited because now the monarchy was done, and the provisional government rises to power on March 2nd, and headed by George Lvov. However, the new government had competition, the Petrograd Soviet. Both governments had no choice but to go with dual power, and the Soviets wanted to make sure that they had enough power, so they went with Order Number 1, which was a revolutionary document, and assured the Soviets they had power. By spring and summer of 1917, the government's relationship was very intense. They could not separate in the event of a disaster, and neither could back away when the other government faces hostility.
Moving on with the next two parts of the Chapter 2, we have the Bolsheviks. Now, during the February Revolution, most Bolshevik leaders are in exile, either in parts of Siberia or emigrated to other countries in Europe. They had opposed the Russian involvement in the war and thought that Russia losing the war would help the revolution, and this obviously made them undesirable to the Russian government at the time. And they returned back to Russia via sealed trains from Germany on the way back, and Lenin is he's the last one to arrive back, and by this time the Bolshevik Party is already going again. Lenin's April thesis. Oh, this picture is the map of how they arrived back from Switzerland to Russia and this is the path that they took to get back there. Lenin's April thesis does not support the new Bolshevik idea of the socialist unity that had been established, and many people are shocked as to why, in his April thesis, he is against this. And in June of 1917, the Bolsheviks are still a minority at the congresses, the Soviet congresses, but their numbers are beginning to increase. Between February of 1917 and October of 1917, their numbers have gone from 24,000 to 350,000. And finally, over to the Popular Revolution. The army at the time was hoping the revolution would finally come and end the war for them. The new democracy for the army, it doesn't really help their conditions. The elections for the officers hasn't really changed much for them. The army was still regarded as proletariat. The workers, or the soldiers and sailors, many of them were peasants, and the officers, however, they belonged to a higher class and were therefore looked upon with dislike. And the women workers now are beginning to increase in the factories as the men are leaving for war. As we see here, this propaganda poster that says, "Women take up your rifles," showing that the women were now called to the initiative to become equals and to replace the men in the factories. The specialized male workers in the metallurgical factories are not called off for war because they have a set skills that are still needed. The factory committees are beginning to emerge from the revolutions of February, and because of this, now they're becoming more or less they're taking up the managerial positions of the factories. Many factory owners are leaving because of these committees, and now the workers are now in charge. The Bolsheviks don't like this. They don't support the idea of a workers' control of the factory committees. They wanted a revolution led by the intelligentsia, a small group of educated revolutionaries, not the workers, because the workers weren't as smart. But they follow this and support it on the front because of it held the popular majority, and they didn't want to lose support at this point. And during the same time, peasants are there's turmoil starting in the countryside. The peasants are hoping for a land reform, but the provisional government kind of ignores this land reform because the extra process of having to take all the land and redistribute it, and the mechanism required to redistribute would be much more work than they had wanted.
Alrighty. Moving on to the political crisis of the summer of 1917, we have the election of Kerensky to the Provisional Minister of War, and Kerensky sought to make a major offense on the Galician front. This was the first huge military action since the February Revolution, where the Germans were just sort of sitting back, watching Russia fall apart. Meanwhile, Russia is resisting the Allied pressure to move into the war, until this point where Kerensky makes a decisive action to make an offense on the Galician front, which you can see in this picture right here. However, Russia completely sucked this up. Around 20,000 casualties on this attempt at the major offense. This lowered Russian morale greatly, which inevitably led to the desertion of the peasant soldiers, and tensions between the provisional government and the military increased greatly. This led to Prince Lviv, who was the head of the provisional government at the time, to resign in early July in a very embarrassed sort of state that 200,000 Russian casualties on this attempted front by Kerensky. Moving on to July of 1917, we have, like I said before, Prince Lviv's resignation which sets off a chain of events in Russia, where at first mass demonstrations and riots erupt in Petrograd, and the Bolsheviks decide to take up on this mass demonstration and march to the Kashinskia Palace. Lenin and the Bolsheviks in this march sought to make it a non-violent march simply for demonstration purposes. However, this led to a major failure in the demonstrations and strong anti-provisional government and strong anti-Bolsheviks feelings among the citizens, where they saw this demonstration fall apart in its non-violent fervor, which inevitably led to the provisional government blaming Lenin and the Bolsheviks for what they called the July Days demonstrations in Petrograd, and finally led to many Bolshevik arrests and other Bolsheviks fleeing the country and hiding in other countries. For example, we have Lenin here, who decided it'd be much safer to be in disguise in Finland, and deserted his newly found friend in Trotsky, who was arrested. Okay. So now Kerensky is made the head of the provisional government after the prince resigns, and he enters into this state of constant turmoil among the liberals on the right and the socialists on the left, and he doesn't side with either one of them. He tries to play the middle ground to keep this chaos from erupting any further. However, while the Bolsheviks are in hiding and lying low, the military, which is aligned with the right and led by Kornilov, attempted to turn on Kerensky. However, Kornilov's mistake was that he mistook Kerensky's feelings towards him, which inevitably had him surrender to Kerensky and caused him to commit suicide, which is not a good thing. This led to the right opposition aligning with Kerensky, which is very good for Kerensky and the right opposition because now they have more of a united front. However, it also led to major gains for the left, which showed working class strength, it showed the weak right's opposition, and it showed that the Bolsheviks remained uncompromised at the end of all of this because they were in hiding. And they came back strong, as you see in the October Revolution, which will be...
Okay, on to the October Revolution. From April to August, the Bolshevik slogan was "All power to the Soviets," which essentially was a very provocative and taunt directed to the moderates who had control of the Petrograd Soviet and who did not want to take all the power. But the situation would then change because after the Kornilov affair, when the moderates lost control. So the Bolsheviks gained a majority in the Petrograd state on the 31st of August and a majority in the Moscow Soviet on September 5th. And Lenin at the time was advocating a immediate armed uprising, or the revolutionary movement. He was in his hiding place in Finland and urging the Bolshevik Party to prepare for an armed insurrection. And he believed that it was the revolutionary moment and that it must be seized before it was too late, and that delay would be fatal. And his behavior at the time was certainly contradictory because, on one hand, he was insisting on a Bolshevik insurrection while he is hiding in Finland. On October 10th, the Bolshevik Central Committee agreed that an uprising was desirable in principle, but clearly many of the Bolsheviks were inclined to use their position in the Soviet to achieve the nonviolent transfer of power. And there are many doubts about insurrection, and strong objections came from Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, who were Lenin's old Bolshevik comrades. And they believed it would be irresponsible for the Bolsheviks to seize power by a coup and hold power alone. I'm not going to finish. 10 seconds. And arguments were published in the non-Bolshevik newspapers against Lenin, and